Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa and this is part 4 of my summer project, and today I'm talking about the accessories. So when I started planning this project, I included this stays inspired top to go over the dress. So that's what we're making first. I started out by holding a copy of my basic bodice pattern up to the dress and just marking where the embroidery around the dress neckline ended. I then changed the shape of the neckline on the pattern to a square neck using those markings on my pattern to make sure that the neckline was wide enough and low enough to not cover the embroidery on the dress. Next is the shaping of the pattern. So when I was looking at stays inspired tops before I started working on this, I noticed that a lot of them had sort of like multiple panels and they all kind of angled down towards the center front. So I decided to do something similar to that. I took a ruler and placed it at the corner of the neckline and then angled it down towards the waist, kind of at an angle, slightly angled towards center front. So that was panel number 1. I cut it apart. Then for the remaining piece, I just cut what was essentially just a princess seam along that side from the waist to the armhole, which gave me panels 2 and 3. Now obviously I needed to add seam allowance where I had cut these apart, but before I did that, I lined up all 3 of the panels so that they met together at the waist and put a piece of paper underneath. I then drew a diagonal line from the side seam down to center front, going downwards so that the center front would have a bit of a point. Then I just cut apart the pattern pieces again because they were connected at that bottom spot, and added seam allowance along all of those areas that needed it that had already been cut. Now for the back of the bodice, I just used my regular princess seam back bodice pattern pieces and then created a template to lower and widen the neckline using the same methods that I did for the front. Now it's time to cut the fabric out. So for this, I am using this flannel backed faux leather, which is kind of leftovers. In fact, some of it got pulled off of last year's summer project. And it's a good thing I did because otherwise I wouldn't have quite had enough. So one pattern jigsaw puzzle later and I got all of my pieces cut out. Now my plan was to do a side zipper on this top and then have like fake lacing on the front so that I wouldn't have to lace it up anytime I wanted to wear this. Not that I was really planning on wearing it that often, after all it is a costume, but I just didn't want to deal with that. So I needed the center front and the center back cut on the fold. Unfortunately, I discovered that I could only get one cut out on the fold, so I cut the center front on the fold and just cut 2 of the center back with added seam allowance along that center back seam so that I could sew them together. Of course, it was after I cut everything out that it dawned on me that doing a side zipper would not work unless I was able to find a zipper that would separate. So rather reluctantly, I ended up deciding to make this a front lacing bodice, like with a functional lacing, meaning that I had to cut up the center front in order to separate that piece. And had I known that, of course, I could have actually cut the center back piece on the fold and saved having to sew that seam. But of course, I didn't realize that until after the fact. Before I started assembling this bodice, I did go ahead and serge all of the side seams on all of the panels. And this is because the bodice isn't going to be lined, so I wanted those edges finished and I wanted them finished where I could press them open. After that, I stitched together all of the panels until I had 2 front bodice pieces and 1 back bodice piece. Then I top stitched all of the side seams. One, because to me it just looks better for this style of bodice, and also because I wanted to create boning channels. I then attached them at the shoulder seam. While the top was still laying flat, I wanted to go ahead and finish the armholes. So I made corded piping, and I took one of the raw edges and trimmed it down to the width of my seam allowance while leaving the other one wider. This allowed me to line up the edge of my piping with the edge of my bodice armholes and stitch it in place, so that way I got the seam allowance right, but then still had enough on the other side to fold the piping out and then fold that other side over and under twice so that I could hide all of the raw edges. And then I just sewed the side seams, pressing those open and top stitching them just like I did all of the other side seams. Next, I attached the corded piping along the neckline, starting at the center back and working my way all the way to the front. And this just closed up all of those channels that I created earlier. Instead of having to buy something else, I chose to just put zip ties into my boning channels, because this garment, I wanted to add some stiffness to it, but it wasn't like a structural garment like a corset or anything like that, so it didn't need to be but so stiff. So I just trimmed the zip ties down to the size I needed, trying to leave enough room for the seam allowance, and slid them into the channels. Now there were a few that were longer than my zip ties, so for those I just glued 2 together and then trimmed them down to the needed size. And the actual princess seams are kind of curvier of a seam, and so for those I actually put the zip ties in 2 pieces. So I put one in and then stitched under it, and then put the other one in from the bottom. And that just allowed, because the top half was the part that's going to twist kind of funny, that just allowed for that piece to turn however it needed to, while the one at the bottom could just lay flat. And on those seams, I only did 1 per seam. So I did it, obviously, if you think about it, the seam allowance is pressed open. And I top stitched down each seam on either side of the seam allowance. Oh, no, each seam allowance down on either side of the seam. So for most of the other seams, I actually put the zip ties in on either side of the seam. But on those that were a little less straight, I only did it on one side. So then I finished attaching the piping around the rest of the raw edges of the top and folded it under and stitched it in place to finish those raw edges, just like I did on the armholes. Now I have this old phone pouch that I wanted to incorporate into this look because it kind of matched the aesthetic that I already had going on. And it has these clips that it can just clip onto something. So I just took tubes of fabric and added them to the inside of the top, down at the waist, kind of where I wanted it to hang, and just clipped it on. Now for the eyelets, I hand stitched those down the center front. I started by doing one at the top and one at the bottom. I then lined those up, folding the bodice in half so that I could find the center point between the 2 eyelets, and stitched a 3rd one there. I then centered the last 2 in between those first 3. And then I repeated for the other side. And to lace the bodice up, I used 1/8 inch black ribbon. Way back when I had planned this project, I considered doing cuffs, like arm guards. I didn't draw them because I really wasn't sure how to draw them, what I wanted to do, all that kind of stuff. And by this point in the project, I really didn't know how to make them, and I didn't want to spend a lot of time trying to make them. I had looked it up a few times, but everything that came up was like using foam, and I definitely didn't want to do that. However, I had these pieces of fabric that I had pulled off of last year's summer project. There's same fabric as the top was just made out of. And originally on last year's project, they were almost like shoulder pads. And it was basically a long, skinny oval that I had folded in half with like a stiff piece of fabric in between, and then did some decorative stitching across the top. So I took these and added some Velcro to it to make really simple arm guards. And with that, my look was finally complete. Thank you so much for joining me for this project. I know it was a long one, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll join me next week for another handmade happening.